I find that unless we go to the elders directly, it is hard to get a story. It's always told from somebody else's perspective. I listened to the radio in Greenland where they have a series of Knud Rasmussen's travels from Greenland to Canada. It would have been nice to hear it from also the Inuit who encountered explorers or people that came from the outside. I think our own stories should definitely be out there because we talk about different things. I always thought Inuit women in particular are so strong. Our voices are totally magnified. Sila Kluches, Mary Simons, and the woman who went with Knud Rasmussen on their explorations. There's so many powerful Inuit women. What empowers us women during that whole changing of our culture, being moved into communities and our autonomy being taken over or run by outsiders, we learn to survive. I always go back to what the elders would say, because you have to respect the environment. You have to respect the animals. That's why we got the tattoos, to respect the sun, to respect the sea goddess, and to respect our environment. I do firmly believe that Inuit way of being is so important. I think we need to retain that Inuit knowledge of respect. Everybody is accorded the same respect and the same space. That's what I learned, and it took me many years to learn that. In the Inuit community, it's always us. In Denmark, and what I learned in Greenland is me first. It's me, and then it's everybody else. I've sailed the Northwest Passage a few times. After I got my chin tattoo, I was sitting in the audience when one of the NTI presidents stood up in the parliament and presented the name for the Northwest Passage, which is Tellotit. And I remember my pictures being taken through the Northwest Passage where the name comes from. It looks like the chin tattoos. The mountains come down like this, and there's lines going like this. And they look like women chin tattoos. Huge, huge mountains going right down to the ocean. That was the proudest moment, looking at the horizon. Me being at the time the only one with chin tattoos, and the Northwest Passage's name being presented to be the chin tattoos of a woman. That to me was amazing.
Since I guess 2014, I've really done a deep dive into these icy worlds and the conceptual possibilities they open up. I don't think that this is an instantaneous process of learning to reorder the conceptual coordinates of your world or your thinking. We have these ideas that humans are special, we're different from the rest of the world. Oh, but now we've pumped so much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that we're now threatening all existence, biological existence at least. What does this mean then if we're actually a geological force on par with the orbital tilt of the Earth or tectonic plates? I feel like it's one of those things that is a process, like relearning how to see the world. Sea ice offers a kind of positioning that decenters human beings. And so what are some of the ways to offer a glimpse of what the world looks like from the perspective of sea ice? Sea ice produces its own time. It takes a while for it to melt and to grow, and that some of those anomalies in thickness or temperature are remembered by the ocean. And that changes how the sea ice grows and decays. And so that has a time scale that's determined by the ice itself. And that's also different from time that humans make with calendars or clocks. This is a time completely independent of human timekeeping devices. Sea ice also can generate completely different timelines and different realizations of the future. This ability to produce the future is not exclusive to human beings, and also just inherent to the ice itself as frozen water. It does release, in some ways, a different temporality. Like as it melts, it's unfolding in time in a certain way that entrains human beings insofar as we're trying to like organize shipping or create policies to combat greenhouse gases.
Rikiltau garlikan nanapaku tu kasang nung masukiak ayayayayayayayayayayayayaya. Upig juili langata ukaw tilumi vanga kangatara wili tukta kasang niyarigavin sukiak ayayayaya ayayayayayaya ayaya. Kangatang ayo rama kangatajang itung asukiang ayayayaya ayayayayayaya ayaya. Kangatajang itung kangatang ayo rama sukiak ayayayaya ayayayayayaya ayaya.
Kulle ukututigi babu nakatutigi lugi kaumatutigi lugi kanuri matuk simaju taimanya kile ukutawatutilu taima kanuri machiaka batuk simaju ili ikiga shongi tuarwi ima machatita shongo bayo ima yokta marna ima dengan tutik taga pingwala tuta isita kogo kau matu imay chokro tuina wala kau maju bega kanya nakta bengar kau maju bengar wiak tu tay mau kata ju maju kanu tuina cia ko sama kodok se maju alla mana mo isu makata takka asi waktu mana pekang kanu dapat to kangemat ang ti naliw ko makata kata kulang meg ima sabi kaya kurume mikiyu ko ami amalok tu changani amalo manicangini takut kalau titau taima amalo kana ukiuko kalau kayu niluni taima dengan yuni apa yuni tana kulle akat beka kuna memang taima na cakata nili kuma kata ang yuga yang mata supuyo kau nang supuyo ida ilingan kaloni tama kucolo tu aja tu kucolo kalau mata mana memakwa Aduh, kalau aku kadang itu nyalaktamu. Saya kisah aku ni aku ti, saya aduh kacak cua kalau saya makwa.
The first thing you see when you look at any of those expedition photographs is all those men in their gorgeous fur clothing, and who made that clothing, obviously. So if you're thinking particularly about the North Pole expedition, many families got on the ship at various communities in Greenland, made their way across to Ellesmere Island and spent a year there. So women, children, dogs, everybody went across, and all those women were there to sew clothing, and they had to, of course, sew clothing for their families as well. This was all additional work for them to do. And in some men's journals, especially the ones who were in the Arctic for the first time, and they're just astounded that these women can just look at them and then go make clothing that fits them perfectly. They're so good at what they do. Nowadays, when you go to North Face and buy a pair of hiking boots and stuff like that, you don't think about the fact that the only reason those men survived is because they had clothing and footwear that Inuit women had made. They just never would have survived otherwise. The technology didn't exist. Still doesn't really exist. There's nothing quite as good probably as that clothing for people.
We often forget the role that Inuit women played with these explorers, and that we still use the same clothing today. A lot of times we use different cleaning methods, but the process has not really changed since then.
Yeah, and it's because they had perfected it over so many generations. It's amazing. They saved those men's lives. That is what they did. The whole thing would have fallen apart without the women, but it just gets left out so much. And yet it's the foundation of everything It's life-saving equipment. I'm coming at it from an outsider and getting this from things that I've read, but it seems like there's so many beautiful stories about women and lamps, and there's the technical skill of keeping a lamp like that lit and burning cleanly that is so important. But then that whole idea that it's the soul of the house and that together they're the soul of the whales that their husbands are hunting and things like that. It's just such powerful, not just powerful imagery, but a powerful way of living your life. And then when they get to Ellesmere Island and there's nothing, and it's because nobody really would want to live there. So there's not, well, the sea ice, it's just churning sea ice. It's bad habitat for seals. There's just not a lot there that would draw people to living in that spot. So there you've got these women they've come across. Some of them brought their lamps, we know, because we found pieces of broken lamp, but they could not possibly have brought enough seal oil to burn, and they were not getting any seals because there just wasn't any seals to hunt. And so they ended up with these awful kerosene lamps that were built, I think, by the engineer and the fireman of the Roosevelt. To me, it's just such a totally different way of heating your house and cooking using smelly kerosene with a cloth wick and things like that. You need to learn a whole new set of skills. And for something that's so closely tied with your identity, it had to make a difficult situation even worse. And there was a lot of tension, and the women had problems. When the men were out sledging to the North Pole, the women were there with the ship's crew, really. So these men who didn't care about them or the Arctic or anything like that. And the social situations alone had to be very challenging. And then to have something that is really touching at part of your core identity, in a sense, it had to have made that situation so hard for them. And yet they managed. They came through it, and they went back home, and they didn't use kerosene lamps until a little bit later. What Peary's expeditions showed was that they're resilient and they could survive that kind of work. They made really significant contributions, and obviously Inuit women continue to make significant contributions.
A lot of them wouldn't have survived without Inuit women sewing and making clothing. She's my great-grandmother. She was bossy. She was a matriarch. She was the Minyo to the family. She was the elder woman. Hudson's Bay Post had a daily journal entry, and Hudson's Bay Post manager wrote about her dying and then mentioned that whenever there was a catch of fish or seals or animals harvested, she always made sure that Hudson's Bay boys got a share of the harvest or the catch. And when she died, that's what he wrote about her death. And even my first time going to the Hudson's Bay archives, I said my name and that I was the great-granddaughter of Shoe Fly. And in about 5 minutes, 3 of the curators and archivists came down, and they were all happy to meet me. They had read about Shoe Fly so much, everything I wanted to see. The original documents and daily logs were made available to me almost instantly because I was a great-granddaughter of Shoe Fly. She was a very good seamstress. I've seen her work at the museum. Her stitches look like pencil marks, tiny pencil marks. That's how intricate her sewing skills were. And when I see a picture of 20 or so whalers, a crew of whalers that wintered, and they're all clothed in caribou clothing. And they would winter sometimes 4 winters in a row. They wouldn't have been able to make the clothing themselves. It would have been the women, not only the women, the men too, and families together would go traveling and go inland to harvest skins for clothing. There's a picture of the crew of the Neptune, which was a government expedition in the early 1900s. They're all dressed in caribou clothing too, and there's almost 40 of them, I think.
You and I talked a little bit, the first time we talked is our problem or issue with the word explorer. Like,
yeah.
What do you think of that? I think you also said that Inuit at the time could also have been considered explorers, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
but they don't get that title. I mean, they don't get that title or that recognition, but we left Alaska and went all the way to Greenland. Our legends, our stories, and root words in our languages are similar. So they were, in a way, explorers, in my opinion, that are unwritten history that goes back so long. A lot of indigenous cultures were matriarchal, matrilineal.
Yeah.
We follow the women.
Yeah.
We don't follow the men's line. That'd be a constitutional challenge. Or land claim challenge. Yeah.
L'épave en tant que telle, elle n'est pas très profonde. Donc, on voit très bien la visibilité, la luminosité. C'est superbe. Maintenant, les comptes dans l'Arctique, le froid, il y a un peu d'impact des glaces qui, malheureusement, contribuent à sa dégradation. Par contre, elle est en excellente condition. D'habitude, on travaille sur des sites qui sont tout brisés, qui ont été ouverts ou qui restent plus grand-chose. Alors là, on passe la surface, puis on se ramasse avec une structure 3D complète. C'est impressionnant, ça vient nous chercher. À chaque fois qu'on s'approche de l'épave, on a une sensation d'incroyable. On a une chance énorme de pouvoir travailler sur une épave comme ça. Mais on est aussi, comme on est plongeur professionnel, on est écus aussi sur la tâche qu'on s'en va faire. On a autant la portion extraordinaire, puis autant la portion, OK, mais j'ai ça enregistré ou j'ai ça à fouiller, ou là, on a une opération délicate, on fait de l'échantillonnage, il faut qu'on aille prendre des mesures. Donc là, on tombe dans l'habitude, la science. La vie marine, c'est incroyable. On a de la flore et de la faune qui interagit avec les structures. On commence à voir tranquillement l'impact un petit peu le site voit côté conditions environnementales. Donc, avec les changements climatiques, ça nous amène à nous questionner, à savoir, ça va être quoi les impacts Est-ce que le pH de l'eau va changer? Est-ce que la température de l'eau va changer et va faire en sorte que l'épave va se dégrader plus vite qu'on pense? Ou on est capable de ramasser le plus d'informations qu'on peut pour pas que les informations soient perdues, puis de mettre en place des mesures de mitigation. On a trouvé, par exemple, plusieurs assiettes, des artefacts qui étaient liés à Edmund Hoare, qui était le Captain Stewart. On le sait parce qu'on avait son nom dans la liste, puis on a retrouvé des artefacts qui sont liés à lui aussi directement, incluant par exemple des pièces de monnaie qui viennent de Chine. Puis là, ça vient en fait de un des voyages antérieurs qu'il a fait il y a plusieurs années auparavant. Donc là, on tombe dans l'histoire de ces personnes-là aussi. Puis c'est une façon de rentrer un petit peu dans leur intimité maintenant qu'ils sont disparus.
I research images and texts created on ships of Arctic exploration in the 19th century. Anyone who takes even a glance at this type of history will quickly become familiar with images of ships perilously trapped in ice and vast, seemingly barren landscapes. There was a public narrative, which still exists today, that relies on the sublime darkness and, yes, polar bears, to create a breathtaking stage where the adventures of British and other white male explorers could be reenacted. But I've always been interested in pictures and texts that run contrary to this image. For example, British explorers dressing as women in theatrical productions, or writing about doing the laundry, or sewing their own costumes. Right now, I'm especially interested in women in the 19th century Arctic, particularly Indigenous women who not only thrived in the Arctic, but who gave considerable help and assistance and expertise to expeditions, often with little acknowledgement. For example, we have many instances of translation, navigation, cartography, and creating expert cold weather clothing for expeditions. I'm now using English language records of exploration to try and follow some of these women, if you like, over time. And when I look at archives especially, so handwritten journals or letters, what I find are more detailed descriptions of women than in published work. So I'm aiming to gather historical data on them from the archives, and I want to ultimately share that knowledge with communities in the Arctic, the places where these women actually came from.
Tamanna angnai ayungit binari man namutaman asyo kong gitarra annogadjonna kameleonna ananabut kameleo katrauto tupelpot iglokamissagaraata iglulittaami taunungakataarluta teemeittunukkisan oqquksautiliorlutik amaagaru taanna makpaimmi sanayunnangiluartillugusugusiuraarlunga teemeittunik taakkoiru parisi qalluna tikisimayunila oqquksaausiortorlutik qimuksikku taununga ataataga ilaurluni aat kisar kurisfyu aka urasaluria qattaraummat qimuksikku upengaksaangurraangat taununga niuqqullut qimuksikku suqas qagata suqaraungimma taissimani teeman nuusaqarau simayur amnain oqquksaausiorlutik suqai niuveqattaraungimmat annoraaksanik niuverpigmi qisinniklu annoraaqarputtuvi tuktunniklu aminginnik Umangari soqosiulunga qallunaattani annoaqaluqtillugi soqqoisuuttunga kisiane oqquksuuti tuktuuyaqaqarparluta aullartorsuuti itaissimani ikkiingulaarnersaaloqqoya nuna unganartualummattau katsaanarmallu.
I was first introduced to the Arctic on a trip with a company I worked with, and that was a long time ago. I was a Zodiac driver, and Pierre Trudeau stepped into my Zodiac. He learned of the fact that I was part of the first team of women to ski to the South Pole in 1992-93. It was through some of his stories that I first learned of Pond Inlet and Inuktut and Beachy Island, what was going on up there with the Franklin expedition. And so I have been back and forth to the Arctic many times, but mostly down in the Antarctic, probably close to 100 times. I'm skiing to the South Pole, and I'm seeing and feeling curvature. It was a very strange emotional feeling that I'm skiing up to the bottom of the world. We saw nothing for 2.5 months. And in that wide expanse, I was fixated on the end of the expedition because I could not emotionally and mentally understand that I was going to be skiing towards a horizon that seemed endless. And so in my head, I couldn't grasp with 1,500 kilometers of nothing. So I fixated on the end, just as a goal. It was maybe just after 1 week. I start realizing that I can't keep thinking about the end, because the end is so far away that my days will be full of agony if I'm always thinking about this being over. Because I have no landmarks, I have no features to reinforce where I am. Where am I? I'm in the middle of nowhere. And so I became more present than I have ever been in my entire life. And I understood for the first time what it really means to be in the moment. And I had to take one step and one breath at a time. And I realized how powerful my mind was. And that I had the ability to either jeopardize the entire trip by what I was thinking or create success. And I thought a lot about that because I became extremely sick on this trip. Anne Bancroft, the leader of the expedition, she was afraid that I was going to fall into a hypothermic sleep. And I blew up like a balloon. My eyes in the morning were swollen shut, and I had crust, and I had to literally peel the eyelid in the bottom up so I could see. And then I had tendonitis in both feet. And then it became really hard for me to see and really hard for me to walk. And those were the two things that I was required to do, walk and see. And I couldn't. And so then my horizon became an internal one. And then I felt so connected to place and time. It was a very spiritual experience for me in a lot of ways. I started to notice things that I never saw before. I started to notice the sunlight shining on the snow crystals, and I started to see shapes in the snow and the sastrugi, and there was so much movement on the frozen tundra. There was so much life.
The article that I just dropped into the ocean was picked by Bernadette Dean. Her Inuit name is Gjoa. Gjoa was great-granddaughter of Siuselnak, known by whalers as shoefly. Siuselnak was interpreter, seamstress, cook for the whalers, primarily comber, the whaler known as comber, and I thought it was appropriate to remember Bernadette, Gjoa, and Siuselnak's role in first contact and early contact. Tukuluktup, takuluktulit, lunit, kalimajakataloktu, hanang ilivinganulak si magano. Ilivinganulak si magata, Jessica Houston lo, Debbie Breeze Bualo, America nunangani, ikkay jutigil, viga kate loktaka, anaga, kinilok si magakutaw, Hamilton, Ontario, nalilugo, ilivinga, nananak si mangito, kinawagaya nga, nakingakto minawagaya nga, kasi ani nasaw tikot, nanilok si magaka. went and found Tuktoyaktuk's grave, also known as probably Tuktoyaktuk, and also known as Hannah, English name given by the whalers. We found her grave in Groton, Connecticut, when myself, Jessica Houston, and Debbie Brisebois went to visit her grave. It very much reminded me of the time I searched for my grandmother's grave in Hamilton, Ontario, and I found it in the Chinese section of the cemetery, identified only as a number. There was no name, such as her name was Josie, at the gravesite, nor her E number, and I took my mom and dad to the graveyard to visit her gravesite, where I think my dad felt a lot of relief to finally know where she was. She had died in Hamilton, Ontario, probably due to tuberculosis, because that's why she was down there, to be at the sanitarium. And the family always wondered where she was, and I'm glad we were able to find her.
Sin agau qaraqlu parisimmeutamuroqmata ataatakkuka maangan igartuatungaaninu taqasunnarma ataqarto takkananinu naqaqqoorsuta 1948 umearsuarma ikigatta unungatuqaalu talluqumma nunataartitaulorsimagatta 52 tiserinariannikatavva Gjoa Haven aunartitaulormayu tayanik aqauqaleralorpungaqaai nuqartaarlungalu taunani teina qammanam ammatavva akukittormiutikinnameqimukserluti nukappiangua innariuluni shakkinguama erneqarluni sunauvauqua nunataarinaartatta kangarluani nunaqarmata alisikku tamaane kanatami nannoqattaquyingemmat innamiggiuku nunaqalertigula kanatami taakku nukappianguakku nersupilialunga qaviyimagami nannoqattiartumillu kupileriruuyarsimaqqoorami uqallakataruuyaqattaqami alisik inoqayaangittiartumu nunataartitauyartusigigu auyartillugu uvagutuakulu qatigiyagalaagu Gjoa Haven qimaksutigu teina polisikku agayoqqaaqayaortaga 100,000 teina agayoqqaaqayaua tammana asuilana kumenartorsaamaqqai uvagutuaq ilagiituakulu polisikku tammarru unaginiartattinnaattiartualugu tasunauva kiulimaa ataatavu akkissiualu eqqanaajalorsi nunataagasu juveortu noqqalaorsimaqqoogillatta Alexander of York ataqaqqoortuugalaa nunataagatlutigurku Inuktut ataqayaami sanangoorvingortitaulu palisikku uuvaaqattortuugalua unnuakku inuvialung meoruyoqqoor tusarsaaqattarmata taikku naanaqattortaalugu Nunagiyavutta ujakkattigutakanna arnai tauka iksivaortun tauka qisilerium makuaru inisimaortangit No qarotinulluman qamilutau kanattiavini isivisimaortu saluarseq. Wa ajornartoqaqquyingittiarluni. Amma taqanartoqaqquyingittiarluni sunauva taqanartualugaluarluni. Piyaksaqaluaraaluqattarluni. Iman uqattiangisaktumi taqajualuunerartumi. Ikajortaujumaluti quviasungiilertumi. Uqarnerlualortumi tusaraorsimangillu tamatsequvianartu innaaqquusi aqusaarpattiaja aakkavinerulugaluarluni suuqamma quvianangilluni tusaatitauruluusatsaanginnatta imanna uqallaqatigiikkutilluni tusarningit suusiu tusalluangitangini tusartitautsaangittiaqatta qaujimajouttiarluni piruppallianerput innarmuttikippallianerput makkuasurusersiutaungittut uvattinnutusartitauttaijuttiarluti suuqamma inuuserpu nikagijaumman aannequjaungillutalu iluangillutissartaaqojaunatalu sivunermut naammangilluorutigilaartattinnik pijauttailimaluarnikumu Puatsijouttiartu taalulluni inuuserpu piruqsajauna soqattaloorsimaju tamanna atuutilialuoqqoorsimaju taimannarulumiagugit kappatitauutsaangittiartugut kappianartumi tusa kutitauutsaangittiartugulluunni sumaalulernartumi pititau tailimannikumu ammalu taana qitonqaliugulua sernaaqattangilluni ikajortautiaqattarniarman taimanna Anaana gingitaqaluani taan anaanamituttia inuuvigilerluni akkagaluanilu ataatamitutia inuuvigilerluni suuqaima nagligijauttiarnermini ikkigusukka katingalluti illumullu katigajukluti pulaaqtigiigajukluti
My entire career has been in the Arctic. Started in government, so spent the first 15 years of my career working in the Arctic without ever actually meeting anybody from the Arctic. I transitioned into Arctic science programming during International Polar Year, and it was during that experience I actually started working with organizations in the North and started learning and making friends with people in the North. I think I was starting to change. People were changing me. I just didn't like the way science was continuing to evolve. And that's when I'd heard about Trevor Bell's work with smart ice in Nain, which is where it started. The community of Pond Inlet had heard about it and they had invited him up. So I went with him when he was doing his initial consultations. Community wanted to set up a management committee. So they were the decision makers for how smart ice operates in the community. So I helped him set that up. After we'd been working together for a couple of years, the committee had said, what we want to do next is we want to share our knowledge about how you travel on the ice with that next generation. And that's when I went, that's what I could help with. We spent some time discussing how we wanted to work together. What did they want to document? Who was going to do the work? They wanted to document the language, and then they also wanted to map their knowledge. They all have these amazing mental maps. They're all a little bit different. And it was just a fascinating experience being in a room with all these hunters and elders saying, no, this area is always dangerous in January. And this one becomes dangerous in April when the rivers start to flow. And it was very clear that the community didn't want me to do the work. They wanted young people in their community to do the work. So I just became a trainer and a mentor. And now we've gone from Pond Inlet to 8 other communities with it. Because the community coordinators have learned the mapping and they've got this basic level of digital skills, we then train them in how to interpret satellite imagery. So they've got the smart ice information that's on the ice. They're interpreting the satellite information to provide that bird's eye view for the community so they can see what's happening out at the flow edge or that way by that fishing lake that they want to go to. Our coordinators now take that satellite information. They know how to interpret it so they can show and basically annotate right on it what's going on. They can also overlay the Inuit knowledge on it because the satellite information can't always show you those dangerous areas. They're producing an operational product for their community each week during the sea ice season. It was really about retraining myself, and I'm not done. I'm still always catching myself. Sometimes I just I do stuff wrong and I just have to take it on the chin and go, my bad, and just keep moving forward. They're always teaching me. And even though I'm a trainer and a mentor, it goes both ways. It's just, respecting each other's knowledge systems.
L'océan polaire ouvert, de ce que j'ai compris, c'est une idée qui remonte de assez loin en fait, qui s'est construite déjà pendant le temps des Vikings, pendant le temps des Grecs, où ils imaginaient déjà à cette époque-là le Nord comme une sorte d'Eldorado, comme une zone un peu particulière à laquelle ils n'avaient pas accès, etc. Après, ça s'est plus construit au XVIIe siècle. Mais on n'avait pas de preuves, on avait très très peu de preuves. Mais comme tout le monde y croyait, il fallait trouver les preuves pour y croire encore plus. À l'époque, on pensait que la glace ne pouvait pas se former au-dessus de la mer ouverte, ce qui n'est pas vrai aujourd'hui, on le sait, mais à l'époque, ils pensaient qu'on ne pouvait pas avoir d'étendue de glace au-dessus de la mer profonde, donc on ne pouvait pas avoir de glace au centre de l'Arctique. Il y a une partie des expéditions qui cherchaient ça, il y a une partie des expéditions qui cherchaient les survivants des expéditions qui étaient partis chercher la mer ouverte. Il y a 150 ans, on cherchait la mer ouverte et que maintenant on l'a créée. On pose plus les mêmes questions aujourd'hui. On sait qu'il n'y a pas une mer ouverte, on sait que la mer va s'ouvrir à cause du réchauffement climatique, mais l'Arctique joue un rôle clé dans les climatiques, justement, dans tous les modèles de climat, etc. Comprendre comment l'Arctique va évoluer dans le climat futur et justement comment la glace va fondre, à quel point, comment ça va avoir un impact sur le milieu côtier, sur les gens qui vivent là-bas. Ça, c'est des questions qui restent vraiment ouvertes en Arctique, même si l'Arctique est une des zones qui se réchauffe le plus vite et qui est déjà en train de vivre le réchauffement climatique. On n'a toujours pas une compréhension absolue des processus.
I collect first publication books on the Arctic. This is a first publication. It's called Life Among the Eskimo by Charles Francis Hall. And I also have a book apparently that's older than Canada.
Oh, really?
Yeah, crazy, eh? 1865. That's Tuktoyaktuk, Ipervik Joe, Eskimo Joe with Charles Francis Hall.
Yeah.
Hannah and Joe Tuktoyaktuk and how they survived being on the iceberg. I started researching. Boy, what a story. They survived because of Hannah and Joe's knowledge of surviving up here. And this was their journey from this point off Greenland all the way down near Labrador. They came across a fishing boat, Captain Bartlett, who's very famous seaman. They saw Captain Bartlett's ship. They shot 2 or 3 times when they saw the ship, and because they never got a response, all 31 of them, maybe 8 German guys, scientists, Greenlandic family of 5, Hannah, Joe, and their daughter, Funny, and Captain Tyson became kind of the captain. Hannah had another qulliq. Joe built snow houses, even transported them from that thin piece of ice to a thicker ice, maybe 2 or 3 times on their journey. They got rescued April. When they separated from the ship, they had enough canned food and things because they were emptying the ship when those 31 got separated and drifted away. And Buddington and the doctor didn't even send other men to go and rescue them. It was called the Polaris Expedition. The American Congress funded this expedition to reach the North Pole so the U.S. could claim the North Pole.
Mm-hmm.
But anyhow, reading and writing, that's how I got introduced to Hannah. And then I'd been to Connecticut and I knew she was buried there, so I'd been to her grave twice. We have such a unwritten history.
Yeah.
That's how I got into collecting books on the Arctic and just reading and researching and then talking to Ken Harper too. And Ken said, she's buried in Groton, Connecticut. So when I was in Mystic, Connecticut, it's really close.
Just thinking about where Hannah was from and how she's buried in Connecticut. What did you bring her when you went to see her gravesite?
I brought her little bits of Arctic cotton and Arctic heather, because that's what they used to cook, a needle and some sinew. Yeah. And I brought her roses, and the second time I brought her a rose. Because Captain Comer's great-grandson wanted to go see, so the museum guy and Tom Comer and I, we went together. She has a very prominent headstone. And even though it says Eskimo Joe Ipirvik, his name is on there, as well as their panik. I don't know what her real name was. They adopted their panik from Igloolik area. They had 2 other children of their own, I believe, but they both died. And Hannah died down there and got buried there. Joe was still alive, and at that time there were so many searches for Franklin, and one was a guy named Swatka, and he took Joe with him, but Joe died when they were here.
Hannah was from the Cumberland Sound area. She could be considered one of the first missing Indigenous women because she didn't go back home. Like, how would her family have known where she is? Unless her husband got word back.
But then he died.
And then he died, yeah. Tuktoyaktuk, Hannah, and her skills helped these explorers with seal skins and caribou hides and stuff like that. And now the MMPA restricts our trade when sealskin helped to save these explorers. Not just him, but a lot of them.
I was born in Stanton, and I had to go to residential school with all the other kids in the boat called Immaculate Conception. I didn't speak English, but from what I saw the other kids, when they were speaking their own language, they were strapped. So I had to learn fast how to speak English. Scared, I was only 7. There was a whole bunch of kids. Then there was a priest and brother, and they were manning the boat. And along the way, a lot of kids went out to pick berries. They used to fill up their jam cans and didn't want to come drop for the candy. It was a scary thing for me to leave my parents. I used to get picked on in school. A lot of kids pick on each other. So as time went by, I started fighting back. All my life, I've always had to push back. Where my anger came from was having to leave my mom and dad at such a young age. Going back to the residential school, I seen so much pain. A lot of them commit suicide. A lot of them never made it back home. Some of my friends never made it back home. In a way, I was lucky I was strong. So now life is easier, mostly because of my husband Roy. Slowly got me to the part of life where you have to lean on someone. I am happy now. My life with my husband here at home, I'm happy. My mom went to hospital for TB in her eyes, Fort Smith. I used to want to be out with my friends. I wanted to be playing games and I wanted to be visiting and things like that, but I had to stay home, raise some kids. I'm still a little girl wanting to play. I've taught my great-granddaughter how to make panik, how to make tea. She's only 11 and she can paint. She did really good in sports, Arctic sports. She's not scared to go out and do stuff, and I'm so proud of her. Yeah, she's got that get up and go, and she could stand alone.
Inu na siwang Nome, inu sa karang mata, anna man na siwang Nome. Sunabo, inu siriga medyo aksarong mga me, isi marak koning ito. Inu siriga medyo pinasawang inaw yaklititay man na. Pisuk si marawa mo, tapan inu na inang me, alungat taong. Puyok tuwa waksutik, siya kami aro karangin mata isigaw yakazana tiklo. Puyok tuwa yakangata, aranik tawa waksutik. Siya naksak parang tuksaw ng mata, ugyuga yung amakasinig, tapan ilakotik aturakta minig, siya nakaturakta minig. Kami liurak paksutiklo, nunan ng may sutay man na waktu binin. Teriluaqqoraanguitangin. Innusialuinnarmatu teemanna aksiqornermagaarmi isimaqqoraangit. Uvagulle ajortavu ila inuiariasa teemannauna sukluta quviagagayaqqorunnertapu. Ilaanni teemanna innuuserilaaqartigu quvi anattiarpakkillunittaa aksiqornarpakkaluarluni ilaanni quvi anattiarpaksluni tavvataa silaquyukataquyuktillugu aayakkun panernattiangitillugu naquyuleraangan taanna tavva aksiqornautigivaloq qoormagu tappaani nunaannarmiilluti suuqaamma uqquusautinullu panertuti imannautianginnam qiyuktarpagiirsimat qattaluarnermiyuin alliaqillugu taununga alliningata ataani silaquyukataserpan taakku qiyuktaan igalirutik qiyuginiarmigamitsu panertitausimmanasuklutik alliningat ataani taunaniititaavagtuviniin panerniarmata panersimatillugin igajuluaqtarniarmata taimanna inunasuartuvini tiikkua sivulerilaartavu angupillaktaqaluakka kisianil unikkaatigun tamassa ilangalu atugalaaksimaгаluарлугу soqqiigippillattaqa.
In different periods, we observe different variations of geopolitics and security architecture. For example, the creation of the U line, the distant early warning line, was historically very important as it brought Canada and the United States to work together and to defend the North American continent and against the Soviet threats. And eventually, this led to the creation of the North American Air Defense Command in late 1950s. We see these huge industrial developments or military developments on one hand, and on the other hand, we also see the impact on local communities. And this is, for example, the chemical pollution from the U line sites that cause diseases among Inuit communities, and they are still affected by the industrial colonialism throughout the Arctic. And whether it's the U line or the construction of wind power stations in Lapland, in northern Finland, or mining facilities and infrastructure in northern Russia, or oil and gas pipelines disturbing lives of peoples and animals in Alaska and northern Canada. So this industrial pollution or military pollution caused by those developments are in direct impact on the local communities. This is obviously perceived as something negative. But we also have to have in mind that some of those projects counts on the local workforce. And this might also be providing an opportunity for the people's livelihood. So it's not black and white. During the Cold War, the Arctic was primarily viewed as a military space and rich deposit of mineral resources. Some of the international relations experts agree that political change in the Arctic will be as rapid as climate change there. In the conditions of the fragile polar ecosystem, the climate has a serious security dimension. As the Arctic opens up, it's providing opportunities not only to regional powers, but it also reveals its economic potential in the form of minerals and new sea roads for other actors like China or India. But rather than any conflict, the biggest challenge in the Arctic is the climate change and related threats coming from it.
She taught me how to cut a caribou, flesh a seal. She taught me how to make tea in Bannock. At first I thought it was hard. It was my first time cutting seal, and we were doing the northern games and seal fleshing, and we started just rubbing it with like a knife, and then somehow we won second place. It was really fun learning. Yeah, she taught me how to sew. I only really beaded growing up, and then she taught me how to sew, but then I never really got into it yet because I'm working on different things like Arctic sports and other things. When I was little, I sewn a little jacket. It was really small. I was trying to make a doll's jacket. But then I was doing it wrong and it ended up just falling apart. It was so funny.
I sailed through the Northwest Passage twice now, and that definitely is a theme that would always come up, talking about the whalers and the explorers who came up and like how there's two different worlds happening at the same time. For Inuit, it's Inuit Nunangat. We have always traveled and we are familiar with the land. And there's like a lot of oral stories talking about the different places versus what the outside world sees of the Arctic. When I was on the ship, I would give lectures, and one of the themes that I would talk about often is land place names in Inuktut, because in English, all of these islands and even like the channels, they have English names. Growing up, I only knew the name in Inuktut, and there's a special twist to how Inuit named back then. They were not named after people who, quote unquote, discovered it. It's just describing what the land provides or what it resembles. And I feel like even just that relationship with the land, there's that respect and like understanding that it is not something we own, it is something we work with and respect. There's a lot of stories about the Arctic, but it's more wholesome when like the local community is involved in the storytelling. And I think that's really important. I live on Baffin Island, and then there's a bunch of little smaller islands around because it's common between Greenland and Nunavut. The name qulliq is like Mount Island, and you have Disco Bay around there. They have qulliq, which means the same thing, big island. These names are all around the Arctic. And I feel like within the last few years, we're regaining that sense because there's the water channel above Violet Island. It's called Tuktoyaktuk, and it was named in Nunavut by Inuit, and it's related to the existing names already. There's a mountain over there. The sand would go down, so it creates like a V shape all around the mountain. And that area is called Tuktoyaktuk, which means chin tattoos. So we see that in the mountain. And so when they named that water channel Tuktoyaktuk, it's like the water belonging to the mountain.
Kaya kajangin na maawyang ima Kaya giliw TV sanirununa Ay 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 Katiktuk tapaka na yuga tapaka ya 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 Ting mi ala utunga ala migli Suna valing na kajirtuli Ay 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 Katiktuk tapaka na yuga tapaka ya 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 Meligaling na pagopangiman Utakila tapid awyang iman Ay 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 Katiktuk tapaka na yuga tapaka ya ya ya